All right, so today we're going to cover chapter 5, and this is a continuation of additional tools and techniques that you can use to define your system and design your system at the system level. So, still, even though we're packaging this and calling it detailed system design and development, you have to keep in mind that we're still talking about the system. So, still, the subsystems and components is under that. Those activities are under that, and it's not actual detailed design of components or boards or anything like that. So still looking at the system view of the product or the project. So the things that we're going to be doing here when we look at detailed system design is essentially finishing up all the requirements. So systems engineering, to a large extent, is about understanding the requirements clearly, and that is going to entail a number of technical activities that we need to understand to fulfill the design objectives as dictated by the requirements. Then we need to integrate those with resources and tools and package that data that can come from some preliminary system level analysis or simulation or prototyping and things like that. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the make versus buy decision and how you go about analyzing those choices, because they have to be data driven and they have to be analysis driven. We're going to be talking about prototypes and the difference of prototypes from mockups, and after you have all that, the system design is done, and really you're in a position to start doing what is called the actual development, which of course is going to entail the actual design and generation of all the manufacturing data for the product. So at that point, there needs to be a very important review. So we're going to be talking about design review and also how to incorporate change in a disciplined manner, because there's always going to be changes that come along, but we're going to be talking about how to, in a disciplined manner, manage the changes. That's called configuration management. And also, we're going to be discussing and hopefully showing that all the system engineering discipline, philosophy, activities, one of the main objectives is to pull changes forward, making sure that any changes happen as early as possible in the overall life cycle of the product, because as a rule of thumb, if you normalize the cost of changes to one at some point in time and at some phase of the overall life cycle, if a change happens uh, in subsequent phases or parts of the life cycle, as you go through those, each change is going to cost 10 times more. And due to from a resource, from a disruption, from the lack of capturing market from a business perspective. So it is very important to capture those changes as soon as possible. So a lot of this analysis is geared and meant to foster discussion and giving you visibility into what you're going to need to do in the actual development in the life cycle to make sure that you mitigate having changes later on. So we're going to be talking about that, how to manage those. They're still going to, we want to mitigate them. So we look at everything in the context of the life cycle. So here we have the product life cycle and a serial approach that you could take. So here you could have your system and product design and development. A lot of what we're talking about is here in this phase, and making sure that we have everything, all our ducks in a row, if you will. So we have swift execution on the production, and we have a successful launch to market, and the system can be utilized successfully and also maintained and supported successfully. So we have talked about that a lot. Now, what we want to show also and highlight is that the system engineering philosophy actually lends itself to concurrently start doing some of these activities in production, and even activities that you would do after launch, because you're getting so much insight into the product. So, for example, I want to mention some ties into subsequent activities from this system, product development and design, which is what we are spending all the time in what we are saying in this course. So, for example, we are looking at manufacturability. So, by looking at manufacturability early during the system design and development, you can start putting together your production or your construction or your manufacturing operations, and then you can go from there. We talked about all the maintenance and support visibility that we want to get as part of the system conceptual design. So we don't have to wait until we are here to find out that the system cannot be maintained and supported properly. Or we don't have to wait until we are here to find out that something cannot be manufactured properly. So it actually saves time to do all these activities of systems engineering that we have been discussing in this course, and even issues of retirement and disposal, which will come somewhere at the end of the life cycle. So through that, there is a continuous through the different models of the system engineering approach. Namely, in case of feedback, this would lend itself to be modeled more by the waterfall model. You have a mechanism for continuous communication and feedback, and therefore continuous improvement of the process itself. So these are all good things, and hopefully by now you can see that, and you can see the benefits of it, and you're starting to put everything together uh, from a learning perspective. So another thing that it allows us to do is to understand and identify effectively what type of engineering expertise do you need. So there are a number of engineering degrees, as you know, but each of those degrees map to a number of engineering jobs or engineering job titles. So, and we're going to see some of that, how you can map the design to the specific, not the engineering degree, but the actual, which is the engineering job title, which is actually narrower and more specific than just a degree. For example, if you're an electrical engineer, you could do a number of engineering jobs from an engineering specialty or engineering job title perspective. So having visibility of what resources do you need will allow you to assemble the team effectively, to hire, make decisions of if you don't have that type of expertise in-house, do you have to subcontract it? So it allows you to start looking at putting together the team early and setting yourself up for success as you actually finish designing the product and releasing it to manufacturing. So additionally, of course, once you get that inside, you'll know what type of technical support do you need, and non-technical support from a staff perspective. So you really get a good view of everything that you need because you know exactly what you're going to do. Knowing what you're going to do is so important. You have to know the right things that you're going to do so you can do those things right. So it's a tremendous benefit. And that's why we emphasize so much quality requirements generation with traceability throughout the system and the techniques that we have discussed in the course. So as you integrate these engineering disciplines, you are going to be looking at everything that you need for successful system integration once it's designed. We have discussed, for example, in 3 legs, we have discussed the human factors, we have discussed software issues or software elements, and we have discussed hardware elements. So when you have all that, the primary components for system integration, you also would have understood what else do you need. Things that maybe are not so much of a technical nature. So we talked about hardware, we talked about people, materials and resources, we talked about software and components, all stemming from the system requirements. But there are other things. What do you need? Any real estate? Do you need any specific facilities? What type of data generation? So for example, if it's a medical type of product, FDA has very specific, very stringent requirements for data generation and traceability. So when you submit your data for the FDA, you can, that's part of the review, and they have a specific requirements for that, and it takes a lot of time. It costs a lot more for the project if you need to generate the FDA data, but you need to know, and you need to specify that. And it may be that you don't have someone in the team that has that expertise. So now you have to find someone that knows what is the, in this example, what is the FDA data that you need to generate. And depending on how, what type of review you're going to request from FDA. You also may identify, consumables and peripheral stuff that you may need. So again, the idea is to have everything ready for successful system integration when you are ready for that based on your human aspects, the software, and the hardware. So what we're talking about as you go into the product, the actual development of the product, is this basic design sequence. So we have talked about these activities of system design, keeping in mind that the system and the activities are subordinated to those specifications. And in chapters 4, we talked about the design and definition, mostly the design at the system level and the definition of the subsystems, and system analysis. So if that's acceptable, you're going to actually be doing the actual development, the design and definition of everything, so that at some point you have a complete set of design documentation, and then you can start modeling that from a generation of prototypes, And if that's acceptable, then you can release for production or manufacturing. If at any point you you don't pass that check, then you have to go back to your original definition. You have to go back to your original definition. And if you go far all the way to just before design release for manufacturing, then you really need to, and you fail that check at that point, then you really need to either modify the equipment that you're going to be using for manufacturing or modify your systems so it fits the manufacturing capabilities. So all this is before we do any uh, manufacturing or release to manufacturing. And the idea is that before you get to this one, so the idea is actually not to go through this, because before that, you have three other checks. And what we want to do is, if we're going to have to go back and change something over here, we want to do it through the earlier loop or as early as possible. So going through here, if there is going to be a change, is much better than going through here and so on. So we want to spend as much time up front and get as much insight out front so that if there are changes, we catch them as early as possible in this design sequence. Now let's talk about the selection of resources, and specifically we are talking about resources that, or parts that you would need, components that you would need during your design, components that you would need during your design. There is always a, what I call a buy versus make decision to be made. But you have to look at it critically. So you can have the choice of a component or part that is commercially available and is off the shelf. And you can also modify an existing commercially available off the shelf item, or you can make your own and develop your own technology from scratch. So you're going to have, for major components, major elements, you're going to have to ask that question over and over again, because inevitably you're going to have the choice of buying something that is already made. And now you have to really weigh the pros and cons of those choices, because it cannot be just because it's available. You really have to do an analysis, and it's mostly a financial and scale analysis, depending on the resources that you have from an engineering perspective, to decide whether you use something as is, or take something that exists and modify it, or do something from scratch. For example, normally something that is available is going to be more expensive. Somebody already invested to have that developed, and they need to recoup their investment. It may not be an exact fit. You may be paying for extra features that really your design doesn't require. Or it may have some minor shortcomings, so you may have to compromise your design to use this existing part. So these are questions to analyze. It may be that you can take something that exists and if it doesn't fit quite well, you can start with that and modify it. But then someone started that and designed that. There may be licensing fees and royalties and essentially paying for the intellectual property to use that and modify that design. So that needs to be part of the decision-making process as you analyze it. And on the side of making your own technology and your own component or part, you may not have the expertise. It may take you longer. You may be able to get something that is much less expensive at the end, but you have to analyze, are you, from a timeline perspective and a cost, are you going to recoup your investment, and from a time value of money perspective. So it may be that you have no choice but doing something custom, because markets dictate how they value goods and services. So, and also the competition. It may be that you have to meet competition at certain pricing, or you have to keep the pricing at some point. So you are required to do something custom. On the other hand, it's going to take you longer. There are such things as marketing windows where you actually can benefit greatly from getting to market faster. So part of your plan, and this gets more into the program management aspect of the product development, is you may have a hybrid. You may come out to market and don't make so much money, or even lose a little early with off-the-shelf components, and then as you grow the market, then go and do a cost reduction that includes custom development of critical components. So, but what I'm trying to highlight is that as a product developer or product development team, you have to think about these things, okay? And in the spirit of using diagrams to say things, we basically have a diagram of everything that I've said, where you have a system with some functions, and you can do a functional analysis and trade-off studies of the make versus buy decision, where you you buy something off the shelf, modify something, and or you do a unique design from scratch. Okay, and for example, for modifying something, maybe you retain core technology, but then you change the interfaces because you need something specific. So that's an example. But those are very important choices that product development teams deal with all the time. Now let's talk about mockups and differentiate them from prototypes. So normally when we think of prototypes, every product is going to have, you can kind of break the features of a product in two camps: form and function. So form, how does it interface with the user, with the consumer? How does it look? And then you have functions. What is it that the system does? Now, normally, we, as this group, as computer electrical engineers, we deal more with function and not so much with form. But what we make has to fit in the form. Okay, so we have to work closely with user experience people, industrial engineers, mechanical engineers, to make sure that what we make fits. physically in a product, or also fits functionally in the product to serve the specifications, and that goes for hardware as well as software. So you can prototype something that, when we say prototype, we really think more about the functional part. It could be something that is spread out on a bench and doesn't look anything like what the product is going to be, but there is functionality there, so that is very useful to test electronics, hardware, and software. But there are these things called mockups, which are actually look like type prototypes, and it may not have the function. It may be an empty shell, but it looks like the product, and it may be very useful. After all, human beings are visual creatures, and you can have a prototype that does everything that the product does, and you have it spread out on the table, and most people, if they are mostly lay people, they're just going to see a mumbo jumbo stuff and wires and things and tubes perhaps, and hardware, and the software is hard to, they don't even see, so that's hard to communicate with that. But you can get a great deal of feedback and communication from the marketability of a product if you have a mock-up that looks like that. People can relate to that a lot. But from an engineering perspective, again, it allows you to look at those human factors and experiment also with the maintainability, which eventually is going to be done by humans. And again, you can see how this thing is going to look, how your hardware is going to fit. And it also can serve again as a marketing tool, because you can show what this, you can talk about what it does, but it's harder to talk about how it looks. So that's more effectively shown with something that looks like. Now, of course, if you combine the functionality of a prototype with the mock-up, then now you have a works like, looks like type prototype, which is almost a full product. And normally that's part of the process afterwards. That's after that integration that we have talked about, after you have gone through all the hardware design, both in the mechanical side, on the electrical and computer side, as well as the software. But if you have something physical that looks like, even if it doesn't work like the product will, you can start training personnel and looking at the assembly and fabrication process. You can look at that, and products can be very complex to assemble. And so industrial engineers deal with how you set up an assembly line, for example. And products can be very heterogeneous in nature. I mean, it's we talk about manufacturing with robots and things like that, but at some point, a lot of products, they do require humans, because they can be very many small parts. It is extremely difficult to come up with robots with the dexterity needed to handle small parts. And at the end of the day, you can find, it's just a reality, you can find parts of the world where you can get human labor at a very cost-effective pricing. So that's not going away. So they can start looking at that. How easy is the product assembled? And that's part of the design for manufacturability question that we have been talking about. If the product is meant to be modify it in some way, you can also use a mockup for to test a modification kit. Okay, so you can see that design drawings, materials and part lists, bill of materials, analysis and reports that you have gone to different prototypes, capturing all this. We need to make sure that we capture um, documentation. And again, what I always say about documentation is that we do it for an actual benefit. It's not just to have it, because that doesn't benefit. So I favor very concise documentation. You know that from my requirements for reports. The resources, one of the main resources that we have is time. And the more people write and the more time you spend reading things, that takes time. So if something can be said in a sentence, we don't want to write a paragraph about it. We want to be concise and just deliver what is required. Concise requirements are better than requirements that they use a lot of superfluous narrative and language. So we have drawings and convey a great deal of information visually. So and that's very effective and very efficient. So from a system engineering perspective, this is in the book. I am just bringing it to your attention, and things like that are very busy. I like to put them here, bring it to your attention. So, and you should be reading the book anyways. But as to highlight something that I do want you to go back and spend more time to emphasize on busy things that I show you here, because I'm certainly not going to read them to you. But this is in the book, and it's a list of different types of drawings, pretty comprehensive. It's not all of it, but you can see the different types of drawings and that are used in the development and manufacturing of products and what they entail. So these are very useful to be aware of them. So do spend some time with this. Again, is in the book. Okay. Now, as we start approaching the end of our system engineering phase, and remember that after this we have one more chapter, but that chapter is going to deal more with testing and validation, which is an activity, very important activity, but that comes after you have something. A prototype, and eventually, different levels of prototype as we have discussed. It could be a working prototype, it could be a looks like mock-up, it could be a functional prototype that actually looks and works like. So we're going to talk about all that in chapter 6, but for the purposes of the systems engineering activities, we are wrapping this up in this chapter. And at some point you have all this data and documentation that you have generated. So that data needs to be released. And again, this is a general flow, and it's not meant to be bureaucratic or cumbersome. But let's say you're working with 2 more people in a senior project team. You can follow the spirit of this by checking each other and just spending some time going through that process. And it doesn't have to be like super fancy or formal, but you go through the spirit of it and you have that activity and you check it and you remember that you you seek the feedback, you review things, and you went through a loop of approval, even if it wasn't formal, but this will generate better specifications, better data, instead of basically people just doing whatever they want and not being in sync with each other or on the same page. So so here we have a design data review cycle that is generic in nature. So that would be release for review. And what are the types of data that we would uh, generate, in the type of requirements and design criteria that we would check the appropriate data against, those things that we have talked about, the functional capability, reliability, maintainability, human factors, safety, um, manufacturability, disposability, all those. Any data has to be checked for compliance against the criteria that it pertains to. So if the requirements are satisfied, and again, you're checking again those requirements, you can release it for more review, and then that becomes part of that manufacturing package. And if no, you can then look into improvements, and you can discuss alternatives, uh, and look at the feasibility of alternate solutions. And if there is a design change because of those recommendations, you have to basically go back through the process again. If there are no feasible solutions, then you may have to review or revise the specifications and features of the product. But just like we mentioned in the design flow, the idea is that if you do good system and you take on into consideration and account good system engineering practices, you don't get to this. You don't get to this after you have spent a lot of effort generating data and looking at conceptual and preliminary design. You don't get to this. If you get to this, that spells extra costs, extra delay, and possible failure of the program. So the idea is not to get to this point, but is here showing that it can happen. But again, we want, the idea is to avoid this dead end here. One of the tools that are of great help are checklists. They're concise, they are easy to use, and everybody can relate to them. And you can have different categories. So here's a generic, and again, another generic example of a design review checklist, where you look at general items and items related to design features. So again, this is in the book, and you can read it as well as I can. So I'm asking you to go back, find this, and spend some time reading about the checklist, and also studying the checklist and thinking about the checklist itself. Okay, this is, once you go through it, is pretty self-explanatory. And here's another tool. Another tool, which is the a parameter measurement and evaluation tracking mechanism. So I do want to explain this one for a bit, because it's very useful and you can track and use it. Here you have technical performance measures. So we talked about that back in chapter 3. You had to utilize that in the house of quality. So you can have your technical performance measures, and this is just a handful of arbitrary examples: life cycle cost, availability, maintenance per labor hours per operating hour, reliability related, mean time between failures, the weight. So we have gone through all this conceptual design and different phases of system engineering design. You can use this tool to track where you are. At some point, when you define the technical performance measure, you must have defined either target or ranges for acceptable for an acceptable target. So you can have that shown here, and as you go through your design system and even further into the actual detailed design development of the engineering of the product, you can check where you are according to the data that you have for each of those technical performance measures, and see how you are tracking and hopefully converging to the target, because this is your specification. But it may be that from what you can model and the data that you can gather early in the design cycle, you know that you may be out of the target, but this allows you to look at the trend. And the idea is, are you converging or are you diverging? Because if you are diverging from the target, and that is really a must-have target, then something must be done. And again, the earlier you do it, the better. So this is a wonderful tool to track your design, how you're doing, as you take more and more data on the design parameters and the specifications that you need to meet. And again, there is no, these program milestones here are just examples. You can track it as frequently as you want, as is feasible, as it makes sense for your specific project. So I really like this because it gives you early visibility on a trend, and that way you can get in front of that and do something about it. And the early that you do it, again, is going to save money in the long run, okay, rather than finding out way out here. So that's another conceptual tool available to you that I wanted to bring up to your attention and highlight. Now, this is that chart that I wanted to show, showing it here, but it's related to the resources where you can see engineering design functions or engineering design jobs. So you can see that, you know, they're here, and they don't map exact, or they are not degrees exact per se, but they're more like engineering job titles or functions. And this is not a comprehensive list by any means. It's actually a very small subset, but it shows, you know, if you are, for example, a civil engineer, you may end up being a logistic engineer, or if you are an industrial engineer, you may be a cost engineer, or if you are an electrical engineer, you may be a reliability engineer. So, you know, different degrees lend themselves to different functions or design or engineering jobs. But when we talked about the understanding and the mapping of resources, what we were talking about, and this is a good example of it, although genetic, is that you can then look at the technical performance measures that we developed way early as part of the conceptual system level design, and look at what type of functions do you need and the level of responsibility, or how much the different engineering activities or functions care about that technical performance measure. So in other words, who has to do the most with attaining that technical performance measure? So that is also very useful, because if we go back to this one and we have a problem, then if you know that this responsibility matrix, then you know who needs to work on it. And remember that these are complex systems. So the assumption is that this would be large teams. So and not that you're going to be responsible for any large team right out of school, but you may be part of that team. And if you understand all of this, now you have a level of understanding that you can relate and function as part of that team member in a more effective manner. So uh, again, this is a matrix that relates the technical performance metrics measures with the different engineering functions, and they tell you how much that engineering function has to do with that technical performance measure and at what level, low, medium, and high. Okay, so another conceptual tool of systems engineering that is very useful as you wrap up the system engineering work. Now let's wrap up the chapter talking about design reviews. And again, we are concluding the system engineering function, which is mostly done upfront before the actual design is done and then eventual manufacturing. So this is a very important meeting and review to really start the design activities in earnest. These are some of the things that you need to keep in mind if you are setting, that whoever is setting up that review. But again, the premise is that these are heterogeneous, perhaps teams that are all over the world. They can be, they're going to be very interdisciplinary and diverse in nature. So it is important to know exactly what the purpose of the meeting is, and everybody understand that. And these things may be obvious, but you'll be surprised how poorly meetings get put together, and they end up being a huge waste of time and resources. And so even for your senior project, make sure that you take into account some of these things so you have good productive meetings. I've seen a lot of senior project meetings that are also a huge waste of time. So if you know these things and you put these things into practice, you won't do that. So everybody must agree on a date and location. Again, this may be a team that is all over the world. Of course, the agenda, making sure that there is representation of all the stakeholders. The last thing that you want to do is not have buy-in of whoever has ownerships of different items and then have to delay things because everybody was not on the same page. So what equipment do you need? What type of technology? What data? So a lot of the reason for the review is that there is data to be reviewed. So if that doesn't exist, we need to get it. It's important. And getting the right funding to have a good meeting that everybody is happy to participate in. And finally, the reporting, making sure that there are actionable reporting from the meeting. It's just not just capture what happened, but okay, what do we do next now that we have this design review? So it may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised. There is a lot of literature also about good meetings, because anybody that is actually in the industry, they have seen firsthand how much time is wasted because of poor meeting practices, essentially. So keep that in mind as well. And part of an outcome of the meeting may be a change. So now I wanted to discuss this diagram of the change control process, or also called configuration management. So here is the backdrop of the life cycle, okay? And as I mentioned at the beginning, of today's presentation, changes can come at any time. Now, the idea is that all the changes, best case, all the changes happen here. And if you normalize the cost of a change to 1 here, doing it here is going to cost you 10 times more. Here is going to be 100 times more. Okay? That is a good rule of thumb to take seriously because it has dire implications. So if there is a change proposed at this point or at any time, there is going to be this it's called a change control board, but essentially it has to go into a number of people or process or system that evaluates the change for its impact. And again, these are some of the things that may be looked at, but what are the effects on performance? You can add to this, but at least here we give you a tool with we're seeding that process with some things, okay, that are pretty generic and it can apply to a lot of different products. So effects on performance, how, if something that is already in the field, how is that going to be to impact the resources required? So that's important to implement the change, and the cost. Once you understand of that, then you can look at the feasibility of the so if the change is feasible, well, let's talk about if it's not feasible. You may have a recall. I know of a project that essentially bankrupted a new company. They made this machine, and so the electronics actually were not made well for manufacturing, and it never worked. And now they have this warehouse essentially full of the actual machine without the electronics because they could never get the electronics to work. They ran out of money, and basically now they just have all these machines that are paperweights. And the company ceased operations because again they could not bring the product to market. Then they had to recall whatever they had sold. So that's this here is, so it could be a very bad outcome from a business perspective. And everything at the end of the day is related to business, and people are bringing product to markets to make an investment and recoup that investment. So, but if it's feasible, then you have to come up with a plan and actually implement the plan. It could be some type of kit with some documentation to be incorporated and then tested. It may be that if the change is not adequate because you actually find that all this what you thought that it was going to be, when you actually test it, it doesn't materialize. Again, you may have to redesign. You may be back and at this bad consequence. But if everything works out, then you basically re-release with the change incorporated or retrofitted in the field. So again, this could happen. So this is talking about some of the issues, whether you find it here or here. So you can release your documentation to production if it's not in the field. If it's in the field, you may have to release modification kits or worst case recall product. That again, that's a very bad thing. But the best case is to find it out here. You find it out here. It's all in the design stage, so you have time to react, and so you can see the value. You can see why when I say that it costs $1, a normalized value of $1, or for each dollar that a change here costs, is going to cost 10 here and 100 here. So hopefully you can see that impact as we talk through this. So this process, again, doesn't need to be bureaucratic, but when you have a large team, you do have to have discipline and processes in place. But that doesn't mean that you cannot do it with you and your two teammates in your senior project. If there is a change, go through this process, the spirit of it, to make sure that you're doing things in a disciplined manner and you actually execute in the best possible way. Okay. So that's the end of chapter 5.